Hello and welcome to the Point Blank Show. My name is Abhishek. Most of us take around 22,000 odd breaths a day and barely even think about even a single one. We take that pretty much for granted. But what if the air we breathe isn't just empty space, but a living, moving archive of history, biology, and evolution? I didn't know much about it until I read a book by Zimmer, the award-winning science writer and author of several books. His newest one is titled Airborne, the hidden history of the life we breathe. It digs into the invisible life form we inhale every few seconds. And Carl, thank you very much for joining me on this podcast.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks. And you've written extensively about viruses, evolution, and genetics as well. Now, what drew you to write a book about something as intangible, sometimes elusive for some people, like air?
I think that we all became aware of the air and what's in it during the COVID pandemic. Yeah. And for me, that awareness came about in part by reporting on the pandemic on the team at the New York Times. And so I and my colleagues were writing about this new virus, this coronavirus, that scientists were trying to figure out. Surprisingly, it was challenging for them to figure out how it spread. So at first, I and certainly lots of people in the United States, we would wash down surfaces a lot. Like when we would go shopping for food, we would come back and we would wipe down, the shopping bag and the cartons and the jars and everything, thinking that, people who were sick, had gotten the virus like on their hands and had, handled things, and so that you could pick it up through that contact. And that was the route it was spreading. And that turned out not to be true. There were actually a small group of scientists who said COVID is airborne. And the World Health Organization said COVID is not airborne. And it took almost 2 years for the World Health Organization to officially, in print, turn around and say COVID is airborne. And I was fascinated by that. Like, what's happening? And so I would talk to the scientists who were trying to persuade the world that COVID is airborne, which it is. And they said, well, this is part of a big history. And so to understand what's happening now, you're going to have to look back. They would point out to me people like William and Mildred Wells, who I'd never heard of. And they said, oh, well, you need to know about people like them. And so that took me down this route to discover there was this whole history of scientists trying to understand the air and what's in it. And it's not just COVID. It turns out that the air is teeming with all sorts of different kinds of life. I mean, millions of species, literally, and it goes from the intimate air around us in our homes, all the way up to the stratosphere, all the way to outer space.
Indeed, and in India, air usually makes it to the front page news, especially during the winters. Places like Delhi, Lucknow, even Mumbai these days, it's getting so polluted that oftentimes it's thrice as much as the upper limit prescribed by the World Health Organization in terms of toxicities. That is something that there have been cases where during the Diwali, the Festival of Lights, at some places where there are more firecrackers than others, people have duct taped their sliding doors to make sure even those, sometimes it gets crazy. So yes, in India, air does make it to the news, and because we are not used to breathing the kind of default air that maybe you might get to see in Japan or even in New York or Singapore, for that matter.
Yeah, I think that when the air pollution is so bad that you can see it, you can see that the air is a different color. I've been in cities where air pollution is very bad, and I can feel it in my lungs. So certainly I can see how there would be more front of mind, but it's really important everywhere. And, worldwide, it's been estimated that there are 8 million or more premature deaths from air pollution every year. So this is a terrible, serious problem in India and also in many other parts of the world.
Yes. At the start, you talked about how, despite this being, let's say, so ubiquitous, air, and even the World Health Organization, it took them a while to realize that the COVID-19 could remain active like aerosol it's there in the air for up to 3 hours. It took them a while. What are some of the misconceptions over the years that you stumbled upon, which slowly got corrected as and when researchers and scientists started to build on each other's work on this subject of air itself?
The air has been this kind of intimate mystery for thousands of years. And so 2,000, 3,000 years ago, people would not know that, the air is composed of nitrogen and oxygen and, might have invisible living things floating in it. And certainly in ancient Western thought, there was this idea of miasma. In other words, that air was considered an element. And I'm just focusing here on ancient Western thought. So Hippocrates would see air as one of the elements, and then as you breathed in air, it helped to produce four humors that needed to be in balance. But air, Hippocrates and his followers claimed, could be sort of corrupted, and he called these corruptions miasmas. And so you would just have this physical movement of air that would bring many different kinds of diseases with it. And so each kind of miasma could cause a different kind of disease. And this version, and many other versions like it, lasted for a very long time. Even in the 1800s, people would talk about miasmas or about, corruptions of the air, and would explain cholera and malaria and typhoid and plague, all sorts of diseases as being delivered by miasmas in the air. So then the germ theory of disease comes along, and people like Robert Koch say, no, it's not some sort of mysterious quality of the air. These diseases, many of these diseases, are being caused by particular species of bacteria or other pathogens. And they started to identify them. And that was a huge revolution, incredibly important to modern health. But ironically, what happened was that these pioneers of the germ theory started to feel like the air wasn't that dangerous because, typhoid or cholera, they're not getting to you in the air, they're in the water. They're caused by bacteria in the water. And other diseases are spread in contaminated food or through sex or through contact. And by the early 1900s, many public health authorities were saying the air is basically harmless when it comes to infectious diseases. And that really became the paradigm for basically until COVID.
So despite the fact that you had, I think you also write about how in the First World War, suddenly you had, people falling ill. And there is a very startling stat, which I'm trying to look up, where you write about how 227,000 American soldiers were wounded in battle during the First World War, but 3 lakh, or in India we call it lakhs, 340,000 American soldiers were hospitalized with influenza. So there was still a lot of, all of this was being caused by air, but still the clarity around the subject was missing, is what I understand then.
Yes, so influenza was not new when the 1918 pandemic happened. Influenza itself is a very old word. It comes from the Italian, means influence, which actually refers to the influence of the stars, which ties into some of these, very old notions of how diseases were caused. But certainly in the 1918 influenza pandemic did come about after the germ theory of disease was in place. But it's striking just how little scientists and doctors understood about influenza as it was rolling through country after country. It's estimated that in total 50 to 100 million people died. And the world's population was much smaller at the time. So it's a huge percentage of the world where people died. And yet they didn't even know it was caused by a virus. They didn't know. They thought that it was caused by some kind of bacteria. In some American cities, there were actually vaccines given for this bacteria. This bacteria is not the cause of influenza. Influenza is caused by a virus. And some people who get influenza then go on to develop bacterial infections because bacteria come into those weakened lungs and infect them. And so getting a vaccine for that bacteria, maybe that protects you against that infection that comes in after the flu, but it's not going to stop the flu itself. So yeah, so then the question of how it spread was a terrifying mystery. And so again, a lot of public health experts would say, well, it's a respiratory disease, but it's only, people are just getting it on their hands and then contaminating surfaces, or maybe they're just coughing. They're just coughing big droplets at people. So if someone coughs in your face, yeah, maybe you could get influenza. So they felt, well, if you just keep a distance of 3 feet, a meter, you'll be fine. And so this is advice that you can find during the 1918 influenza pandemic. Just keep an arm's length distance and you should be fine. People were not fine. Now, why, in hindsight, we would say like, well, surely they must have understood that influenza is airborne, but a lot of the basic conceptual ingredients weren't in place yet. So it never really took hold, and it wasn't really until the 1930s that some of those key concepts got developed.
And when was the time when masks started coming into being, where people were not only encouraged to wear them, but I think I read in your book that I think in San Francisco, they imposed a 10-day jail sentence for those who did not wear masks, which means at some point somebody figured that this is important, even if you are 4 feet away, it's important for you to wear a mask, which, as luck would have it, during COVID, I mean, that was the mascot everywhere. Of course, there were split opinions there as well. But when did mask as a preventive measure come about?
Well, the history of masks starts actually in hospitals. There was a very forward-thinking microbiologist named Karl Pflug in Germany who did some simple but really provocative experiments in the 1890s that made him think that maybe there were diseases that could spread from people's mouths. And then it occurred to him that surgeons, are cutting people open. And the surgeons were already being careful to try to prevent infection based on the germ theory of disease by using disinfectants on the skin and washing their hands and so on. And so Pflug said, well, yeah, but then you're just breathing and talking over these patients with these open cavities in their bodies. So let's try putting on a mask. And he persuaded German surgeons to do it. And then eventually, over decades, other surgeons started to wear masks. I mean, you would not go into surgery now with a surgeon who had no mask on. You'd be like, no, thank you. But, and that started in the 1890s in Germany, thanks to this microbiologist called Pflug. But that was, so inside of hospitals, masks are become familiar. It's different when you're trying to get people outside of hospitals in a community to also wear masks. The first time I'm aware of that happened was in 1910 in China. Because in northern China, there was an outbreak of the plague, not the typical form of the plague, which is spread by fleas that are carried around on rats. This is an airborne form of the same bacteria called pneumonic plague, which you can spread by breathing. It's in the air. And a Chinese doctor who was put in charge of trying to control this massive outbreak, it was horrific. I mean, thousands of people were dying. He thought, well, let's try these masks in the community. And he believed that it did a lot of good. That he didn't actually run a trial to demonstrate that they worked, but it certainly was the first time that people were seeing photographs of entire towns where people were wearing a mask in 1910. So then in 1918, the influenza pandemic comes, and some cities, some communities decided we need to wear masks. Not all. But yes, in San Francisco, you could go to jail if you weren't wearing a mask. After that, in the United States, masks went away. In East Asia, in Japan, in China, in Hong Kong, places like that, it became a more familiar sight in the 20th century. People would put them on during flu season or during a bad pollen season. And so when COVID came, there were just these sort of cultural relationships with masks that were very different. So here in the United States, some people, readily wore masks, where other people saw that as being, representing a lot of things they didn't like, about,
Yeah.
the government trying to control what you do. The fact is that, a number of reviews that have come out recently have indicated that overall mask wearing can reduce the prevalence of COVID. It's not going to be a panacea. If you as an individual wear masks, you might still get COVID, but on a population level, it seems like it helps.
Yeah, there was one tweet that was doing the rounds when COVID was at its peak about, a family from 1918 or 1920 all masked up. And I mean, the taglines were more like, Nothing has changed for 100 years, where today we are back to where we were, and let's get back to basics, by people who wanted to spread the message that masks are indeed important. And you said that, how 50 to 100 million people died. That's a big percentage, right? Some 3 to 5% of humanity is what you write. I also like the reference to the Big Shot movie that you make in the book, where Brad Pitt's character wears a mask when he's coming down the escalator, that was the first instance that when I watched it in 2016 when it was released, he basically does a little salute to another Asian chap who is wearing a mask, and it looked odd in that, oh, I mean, this is like fashion state. Why do you need it in the first place, as an ignorant a guy who had, I mean, we never wore masks until I think SARS epidemic was the first time we started in the news that, okay, in Hong Kong, Singapore, these places, people were wearing masks, and that helps. One question: when science very clearly has enough empirical evidence that doing something can at least reduce the chances of spreading infections, why do you think there is a difference of opinion, even among politicians or among people, when you should just readily embrace certain things? Or is there a lot of gray area there because there is hidden agenda, among other things?
Well, the motivations that politicians have, or that lay people have, may be different than what drives differences in the scientific community. I mean, certainly at the beginning of the COVID pandemic, as I write in the book, there were these people, these scientists, who are saying COVID is airborne, and it would be a wise precaution for people to be wearing masks, and preferably high quality masks, not just surgical masks, but these N95 respirators. Now, there were other scientists and public health experts saying, no, the public shouldn't wear masks. So Anthony Fauci was saying that. Part of his motivation for saying that is because certainly in the United States, we had a terrible shortage of protective equipment for nurses, doctors, and other healthcare workers. And so the thinking was, well, if people just rush out and buy up all the N95s, then what are the people who are most at risk, who are in these hospitals working with patients up close? What are they going to wear? The problem is that you're trying to achieve a goal there with a message that tells people something else. You're not saying like masks work and let's protect what few masks we have for the people at most risk. It's just saying like, oh, don't worry, you don't need to wear masks. So that just tells people, well, I guess masks don't work. And then a few weeks later, when the early evidence started to emerge that, yeah, maybe masks would be beneficial for stopping COVID, then, I think a lot of people were sort of skeptical, like, well, what did you just tell us? It's a very big challenge in public health in general. You on the one hand, you don't have perfect knowledge. On the other hand, you need to get millions of people to do something, and you need to make public health recommendations based on the knowledge you have, and then that knowledge changes. Now, among scientists, there were interesting scientific debates, because I mean, the fact is that there were some scientists who felt like, well, the only evidence worth looking at is randomized clinical trials. So show me like one group of people who used masks all the time, and one group who didn't use them at all, and and show me that the masks reduced the risk of disease. And if you don't have that, then you'd have no evidence. And there are other scientists who would say, well, first of all, those trials often don't work very well because, it's not like you're injecting something into someone's body. You're just telling them, like, please wear this mask and please wear it consistently and please be careful putting it on and, don't handle it in the wrong way and so on. And you don't actually know how well the people are using their masks. So if they're not using them well, then any protective effect you might miss it, you know? So there are some serious questions about how well clinical trials can tell you about masks. And at the same time, there's other kinds of evidence. There's physics. So I don't have to tell you that I don't have to show you a randomized clinical trial of hard hats, protective headgear, to persuade you that, and if you're walking around in a building site, you should wear a hard hat. Because I can take a hard hat and, I can try to hammer a nail through it and say, see, it's really hard. It will protect you if a brick lands on your head. So that's another kind of evidence. And there were debates about whether, well, are those sorts of, physical demonstrations that masks can stop viruses, what do they count for? And the fact is, an N95 mask is really good at stopping the tiny droplets that carry viruses like COVID. It's really good at that. You can just measure them on the outside and measure them on the inside, and you see that it drastically reduces the number of droplets that might contain bacteria or viruses that you inhale. It's just physics. So all of that are added up to a lot of different disputes and debates and so on that are still going on today.
The tiny droplets that you just talked about, what was that story around how at an orchestra, a few musicians discovered that despite having taken the precautions, they were passing it on to each other, which I believe is a famous little incident which suddenly got a bit of spotlight. If you could explain that bit.
Yeah, this is an episode in the COVID pandemic that I focus on a lot in the book because it's scientifically very important, and it's a really powerful human story. There was a choir in the United States, a group of singers who would perform regularly in concert halls, and they would meet to rehearse every week. And in early 2020, they were meeting to rehearse every week, and they were aware of the news, and they knew that there was this new pneumonia or that was in China. And then there were reports that it was, maybe there were cases maybe 50 miles, 100 miles away from where they were. And this was in the northwest of the United States, in Washington state. But they thought, well, it's not near us, and we're following the guidelines that the government is telling us. So basically, at that point, the U.S. government was saying, if you're feeling sick, stay at home so you don't infect other people. And, otherwise, keep a 3-foot distance or 6 feet and, wash your hands and, things like that. In other words, it was advice that really would not stop an airborne virus. So they came together on March 10th, 2020 for a rehearsal, and, one of them had COVID, and she didn't have clear symptoms. She wasn't coughing. She wasn't sneezing. No one looked at her and said, oh, you're sick. You should go home. But she had COVID. Over the course of that evening, in this indoor space where everyone was singing and exhaling and inhaling, exhaling and inhaling, she managed to infect, I think it was about almost 60 of the singers. There were about, I think 65 or 68 singers there. So virtually everyone there got infected by this one person. 3 of them were hospitalized. 2 of them died. And so that became a really striking demonstration that somebody who was not sneezing or coughing could infect people at a long distance.
Right.
Under the right conditions. She clearly had a lot of viruses, in her airway, and she was singing. And so she's just, doing a lot of breathing, and other people are inhaling. And perhaps most importantly, they were in an indoor, poorly ventilated space. The windows were closed because it was a It was a cool night. There wasn't any sort of ventilation system that could take out viruses. And so they just kept breathing each other's air. And a lot of them, most of them got sick along the way. So that's a vivid demonstration of what happens with an airborne disease. It spreads like smoke.
And also, science over the years or decades has helped us understand some things that we think are common today. I love this bit in your book, and I quote, where you talk about how mist defied gravity for so long, where you write how a big droplet of water is so heavy that it falls quickly like a tossed marble. But as the droplet falls, it also evaporates. As it shrinks, it becomes lighter. If the droplet is small enough, even a faint current of air is sufficient to push it back up and keep it floating. First of all, it's a brilliant, vivid description of that tiny microscopic bit that's invisible to the naked eye. At the same time, it tells us how big an impact it can have on our lives.
Yeah, it's something that I don't think the world generally appreciated. The fact is that was worked out in the 90s by William and Mildred Wells, among others. And, it took until COVID for a lot of people to appreciate it. The fact that these tiny droplets that we exhale and resist gravity is something that was discovered in the 90s by William and Mildred Wells, this American husband and wife who studied these droplets and started to think about basic physics. That insight, unfortunately, got neglected, not just by the public at large, but was really not properly appreciated by the public health community. And so during the COVID pandemic, there was a small group of scientists and doctors who had to explain to the world all over again that it's very easy under the right conditions for the germs that we exhale to float around in a room like smoke, and they do not fall to the ground. I think we can see, we can see in photographs of sneezes, like this big spray. And so we think, that giant spray, if someone hits you in the face with that, okay, that can be bad. But what's harder to see is this mist of much finer particles. Even the particles within a sneeze, the large droplets, they can evaporate over time as they're traveling in a plume through a room. Yeah, it's been a long time for the world to really appreciate this very basic physics.
These messages that you say sometimes get lost somewhere, and then something has to happen for us to rediscover them. That's happening on one side. On the other side, it's taken over the years or decades or centuries, it's taken a lot of hard work by scientists who collaborate from different generations just to get to an observation, which then later gets lost. For example, you write about how Darwin was found, he was rummaging through his collection of over a decade that he'd collected, to let some of the, what was that, red dust that he found somewhere, to give it to yet another scientist who could then do his own research. And what I find a little sad is that the amount of work that would have gone in back in the day just to get to some fact, and then that fact we somehow, instead of preserving, we let it loose and wait for something the magnitude of COVID to happen for us to start appreciating what those folks did back about 100 years ago. Because your book is also filled with a lot of human stories, and we'll get to that as well. These scientists, can you give a couple of examples like this? Like Darwin was one. There was a lot of cooperation, and I think would it be right to say that they kept their egos aside to help each other, because they would also compete, right? I would wonder whose name should come in the papers first, who gets their word out. There was no Twitter. The printing press was there though. So how did that come about, that scientific community and the collaboration?
Well, I think that this idea that there might be germs floating in the air, it was a very unusual idea. It was a very hard idea for people to grasp. And so the few people who thought, well, maybe there's something to this, they would find each other, I think. And you have to remember that, the first evidence of bacteria and single-celled organisms had emerged in the 1600s with the invention of microscopes. And so, people could see these things, but, they would see them in samples of water, or even like scraping your teeth and putting that that under a microscope. The idea that those little things you're seeing under a microscope are also floating through the air was
Yeah.
not, it was very hard for people to grasp. So Louis Pasteur, so Charles Darwin, you mentioned, he kind of stumbled into this revelation by accident, really. He was not a microbiologist himself, but when he was taking his 5-year voyage on the Beagle around the world, there was this one episode in the Atlantic where this strange red dust just settled on the ship and got into the sailor's eyes, and it was just like a very bothersome thing. And he was just like, well, what is this? Like, we're nowhere near land, and there's red dust coming down. So he collected it and put it in a tube, and then carried it with him back to England along with lots of other things. And he stored it away, and he thought maybe he'd get to it, but he never did. And then over 10 years later, a German microbiologist who was interested in samples of dirt or anything he could get his hands on to look for bacteria and other single-celled organisms, he said, "Do you have anything interesting from your voyage?" He was thinking of maybe soil from the Galapagos Islands. And Darwin said, "Oh, I've got something really interesting. Check out this dust." And this German microbiologist, Ehrenberg, looked at it and said, "Actually, this dust is full of microorganisms, diatoms and other things." And it was really amazing because that told them that living things were traveling probably from a continent hundreds or thousands of miles in the wind and landing in the ocean. So it gave you this idea that not only was there life in the air, but it was traveling incredible distances. And they both really marveled at this discovery that they both kind of stumbled into. And so, yeah, this is a science that came to be known as aerobiology, the science of life in the air. And, it grew very slowly in fits and starts over the decades from the time of Darwin and Ehrenberg working together in the 1840s and then onward until it actually got a name in the 90s, because by then scientists could actually fly in airplanes, and they could collect things literally like in the clouds, or go up in balloons into the stratosphere and collect things there. And there was life all over the place. Scientists have found life now at least 25 miles above the surface of the planet. It might be able to get higher as well. And it's in the air over land and over oceans. It's everywhere. It took a lot of collaboration and a lot of people who were really going against the grain to come up with this. I mean, Louis Pasteur was another person who became convinced about this in the 1850s. And when he was presenting his theory that there were floating germs, one journalist said, "This is just a world that's just too fantastic." It was too fantastic to believe, essentially. So that was the kind of disbelief that aerobiologists had to work against.
And you also link it to history. I don't know how much reading you would have had to do to dig into the Iliad is what you quote, where Zeus sends a red downpour, is what you write, as a sign of coming slaughter. And then there was some shower of blood in Germany that precedes the arrival of Black Death, is what you write. But the scientist Ehrenberg, if I'm pronouncing his name right, he said that this blood rain was real, but it wasn't really blood. So which means folks who had written it down in history books or the books, well, they had some merit, but then he tried to put a scientific layer on top of it, saying that it was instead, I think, was it a mix of some dust and microorganisms, and it went into the sky, and then it was washed down in storms or some such. Now, so there are two things. I have two questions for you, Carl. Is that how do you make these connections, and what kind of research did you have to do, and rabbit holes you had to go in to find that? Then you link it with this, and to say, hey, look, it makes sense. People discovered this first. They didn't know how to write it. So they wrote it in the manner that was a good story, perhaps, and God, among other things. And then somebody comes along and tries to say, hey, that's interesting, but this is the reason why it is happening, which is a different way of looking at things. It's not science, not just science anymore, culture and science.
Yeah. Well, I mean, certainly, I think as a rule, science is never divided from culture and the rest of the world in some glass chamber. I mean, science is something that we do as humans, and the kind of science that we do is affected by history and the cultural events around us. And the ways in which that science is then harnessed and used or abused is also a matter of history, of politics, of culture. It's all connected. And so I think that if you want to write about the history of a field like aerobiology, you have to not just, deliver like a series of facts or a series of experiments, but to sort of really get into what was going on at the time, and or how does it tie into literature. So yes, so as you say, Christian Ehrenberg was this Gottfried Christian Ehrenberg was this microbiologist who started to realize in the early 1800s that bacteria and other microorganisms were far more abundant than people had ever realized. They were everywhere, and they were in water, they were in soil, and then he thought, well, if they're in all these places and they're so resilient, then when the wind blows, like it should be picking them up. And he would find these indirect clues of that. And there are these references to blood rain and the Iliad and other times in history. And he would say, no, that sounds like these kinds of, reddish bacteria that sometimes get mixed in with dust or come down in rainstorms. And it's a natural explanation. It's not some sort of strange divine punishment of actual blood. It's bacteria. And likewise, museums would have these objects they called paper meteorites. They thought they came down from space, basically, like meteorites do. They were these weird, sort of blackish, seemed like pieces of paper. And he put them under a microscope and he discovered, no, these are dried mats of microbes. And he inferred, he was probably correct, that these were actually bacterial mats, microbial mats that grew maybe in tide pools. And those tide pools sometimes dried out, and the wind peeled off those dried mats and just took them up very high in the air. And then once they're in the wind, they can go incredible distances. And so here were these things in museums, these references in literature. And Ehrenberg was an incredible visionary, and he was right. He couldn't do all the science to really demonstrate just how far bacteria and other things can go. We can do that now.
Right.
But he really saw a lot of these things very clearly, in the 1840s and 1850s.
Amazing. And every passing generation, like for example, I remember my mom telling me that when she was a kid, doctors would not order for a host of blood tests just to diagnose a problem. They would just take her hand and measure the pulse. There is a phrase in Hindi which says, nas dekhkar. Nas means the pulse. I mean, there are doctors who can tell what is wrong with you just by checking your pulse. Today, it's different, where you need to, doctors will just say, okay, these are 15 tests you do and you come back to me, which the technology at the time wasn't, amenable for researchers and scientists to rely on such things, so much so that some scientists, put their liver on the line to prove their hypothesis. There was one, sometime in October 1892, that is not really too long ago, where one Mr. Petten Kofer, if I'm pronouncing his name right too, where he just sat in front of his students and he was exasperated. He wanted to prove something. He just drank from a little beaker. What was that? Some vial of bacilli is what you write to prove something. What was that about? And did they have it? I mean, it's quite tough being a scientist back in the day then.
Yeah. So Max von Pettenkofer was in some ways a really great and very important scientist. And so, for example, he recognized how to measure the ventilation in a building. He reasoned that, well, we exhale carbon dioxide into the air, and if you're in a poorly ventilated building, the carbon dioxide level will build up. And so if you have the windows open, then the air is going to mix and the carbon dioxide level will be about as low as what it is outdoors. And so that is actually how we measure ventilation today. I actually carry a little carbon dioxide meter around with me just to sort of be aware, like if I'm on a plane or in a small room, like, this is not very well ventilated. Like I might be at risk of airborne disease. The irony, though, is that Max von Pettenkofer was a real opponent of the germ theory of disease. He believed that cholera was produced by fumes, poisons that rose up like gas out of the ground and filled up people's homes, kind of like, like a coal gas or something like that. And so, you needed to ventilate the air to protect you from those fumes. That's not how cholera works. So Robert Koch, the German doctor, demonstrated that there was this particular kind of bacteria. They called it a comma bacillus, but it's actually Vibrio cholerae, that spread when people have diarrhea or they throw up. It can contaminate water or other food, and it can spread that way when people ingest it. Again, well, Pettenkofer refused to believe this. Even in the 1890s, he was refusing to believe this. And he actually, to make a proof of it, he got hold of a flask of this bacteria that causes cholera. And in front of witnesses, he drank it to prove that it doesn't cause cholera. And he survived. He felt a little unsettled for a day or two, but he didn't have the violent symptoms of cholera. He didn't die, obviously. And so he took this as a triumph, that proof. What he didn't appreciate is that the different strains of the bacteria can be very deadly or relatively mild. And so a lot of people get cholera and hardly even know it. But it spreads so quickly that it can infect a lot of people, and maybe with a particularly heavy dose, or it's a very virulent strain. Then that's how so many people can die of cholera in a very short period of time. So it's a wild episode in the history of medicine. Just it's so strange, and it fits into this history of air biology in this very odd way. So you can be right and you can be wrong.
Wrong. Yes. And talking about all things wrong, or most things wrong, I think when did we start getting into this whole thing of biological warfare, where you said, okay, now we know things can spread through air. Now let's use it to further our political interests. You have dictators on one side, you have politicians on the other from democracies who started looking at biological warfare as a means to get one up on other countries.
Yeah, there was certainly a fear that the germ theory of disease could be turned into a weapon. If indeed viruses and bacteria are causing diseases, then maybe you could use them to cause epidemics among your enemies. And that was a fear in the early 1900s. But there wasn't really an actual large-scale program of research to build these weapons and to really understand them and potentially to use them until World War II. And the reason for that is that it wasn't until the 1930s that William and Mildred Wells started to work out the basics of how airborne diseases spread. There were other scientists who were studying how other airborne diseases can wipe out crops, so to destroy the food supply of a country. Maybe you just spread something that destroys all their wheat. And so these insights into aerobiology in the 90s literally got weaponized. The United States government set up a whole gigantic secret program in World War II. They built an aerobiology building on a secret military camp, and they made a huge number of these weapons during World War II secretly. And then after World War II, they continued to expand this program, again, secretly, until the 1970s. The Soviet Union was doing much the same thing. And, they signed an agreement in the 1970s to stop producing biological weapons. The United States destroyed its supplies. The Soviet Union did not destroy their supplies. They actually kept expanding their biological warfare program until the fall of the Soviet Union. It's really, in the book I show how this was a real diversion of science. There was a lot of scientific research done by thousands and thousands of scientists on aerobiology that was just going into making weapons or developing defenses against these weapons. Nothing to do with, real human diseases, everyday human diseases. Nothing to do with understanding, the air just as a basic science question. It was just all about war. And so I think aerobiology lost a lot of opportunity to mature as a science because of that. And also it led to all sorts of historical outcomes. The war in Iraq, for example, which, in the United States, many look at it as just a colossal mistake. Huge number of lives lost, huge amount of money spent. And what was the justification for going in? A large justification was the belief that Saddam Hussein had airborne biological weapons, anthrax and things like that, which he didn't have. So that fear of biological weapons, that fear of weaponized aerobiology has really been a dominating force in modern history.
You also write about Winston Churchill placing an order or requesting America to ship quite a big chunk of one of these biological weapons as an insurance against, I don't know which country it was, but
Germany.
Germany, right.
Winston Churchill in World War II was very afraid. He was very afraid of biological warfare, and he was very afraid from intelligence reports he was getting that Hitler was developing a biological warfare program so that, maybe he would send missiles to England that could cause, anthrax or some other terrible disease and kill some colossal number of people. And so he felt that he needed to have an arsenal of biological weapons of his own to be ready to return in kind if Hitler did that. The fact is that Hitler actually, for all the horrors that Hitler and the Nazis inflicted, they did not build a biological weapons arsenal. They just didn't. They found lots of other ways to kill people, but biological warfare wasn't part of it. But there was so much uncertainty and fear before and during World War II that you could have Winston Churchill deciding, I need to have hundreds of thousands of anthrax bombs. I have to have them for the safety of my country. And the United States, which was building these things, was like, yeah, we'll give you some and we'll make some for ourselves because we believe that we need them to keep ourselves safe as well. And the Soviet Union, meanwhile, was starting to develop its own biological weapons because it was convinced that Nazi Germany had them too. Japan did. Japan had lots of biological weapons that they were using in World War II, but Nazi Germany didn't. And so fear and bad intelligence and all the rest of it helped to escalate this biological warfare arms race, which would then last well after World War II.
It's a fascinating subject with which the book again covers so many different facets. For example, it's the central idea, of course, is air or airborne. How did you know what should be the jurisdiction? The last question as to how much to pack in. What should you leave out? Where do you draw a line? Was that a difficult choice? How did you make one part of your brain would have reasoned with the other, saying, let me squeeze this in, and the other one would have been the rational one. How did you go about the whole process?
Yeah, that's always the challenge with writing a book, because you want to find a subject that is so rich and has so many surprises every time you go around a corner that it's going to keep exciting you. As week in and week out, month in, month out while you're working on it. And certainly the history of aerobiology is one of those wonderfully rich. There's so many things that I'm really glad that I learned about. But the problem is you can't include everything. And so my general advice for people writing books is don't go about writing a book asking yourself, how do I squeeze one more thing in? You should probably say, well, how much can I take out? If I take out this interesting fact, does the rest of the book actually hold up fine? There are some things you take out and there's a big hole in the book and it doesn't make sense. Those things should stay. But there are a lot of things that are just interesting and they're there because they're interesting. You don't want to, if you don't want to write like a whole, 10-volume encyclopedia, then you need to be cutting things out. And, certainly this book Not a short book, but on the other hand, it is substantially shorter than the first draft. I cut a lot out just because, I could see after a while, like, oh, this doesn't really matter, or I'd have other people read the book and they'd be like, oh, this is really interesting, but why did you go off in this direction for all these pages? I didn't care, and it didn't seem like I need to know that. So that would go out.
Amazing, Carl. Congratulations yet again on Airborne, and also for your time, which you've been quite generous despite fighting a cold. I'm really grateful for you to have offered me this time on the podcast. Thanks so much.
Oh, it's a real pleasure. Thank you. Thank you so much for your interest.
Thank you.